"Who is the girl in the portrait?" the Duke asked, and both sisters stopped talking. The silence that fell in the drawing room was a thing of substance, a heavy velvet cloak smothering the polite tinkle of teacups and the brittle murmur of conversation. I, hidden behind a large Chinese screen near the drafty window, felt the question like a physical blow. I was meant to be invisible, a shadow in my own home, a creature of beige and gray who faded into the wallpaper. The screen was my cage and my sanctuary, a place where I could exist without the burden of being seen and, inevitably, being dismissed. "That, Your Grace?" My stepmother, Lady Seraphina, recovered first. Her voice was a confection of honey and powdered sugar, a sound she reserved for those whose rank far outstripped our own. "Oh, that is merely an old painting, of no consequence." I risked a glance through the intricate latticework of the screen. Duke Alistair Vance stood before the fireplace, his formidable frame eclipsing the pale afternoon light. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, spoken of in hushed, intimidated tones throughout the county. Reclusive, severe, impossibly wealthy. He was not supposed to be here, in our modest drawing room, taking tea. He was certainly not supposed to be looking at the one thing in this house that was truly mine. The portrait was of my mother. It had been painted a year before she died, and it captured the quiet intelligence in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth that was so unlike my own tense, downturned lips. She wore a dress the color of a twilight sky, and she looked out from the canvas not with a vacant simper, but with a gaze that suggested she was listening to a fascinating story. To Seraphina, she was a ghost of the past, a constant, silent judgment. To me, she was everything. "No consequence?" The Duke's voice was low, a rumble of distant thunder that made the porcelain vibrate. He did not turn from the painting. "She has a remarkable face, a thinking face. It is a rarity." My sister, Lyra, shifted uncomfortably. Lyra was the sun around which our small household revolved. With her golden hair, her sky-blue eyes, and her effortless charm, she was everything I was not. She was born to be seen. I was born to be overlooked. Seraphina had been grooming her for a brilliant match since she was in leading strings, and the unexpected visit from the Duke, the most brilliant match in the entire kingdom, had sent her into a flurry of strategic excitement. Lyra was on display, a perfect porcelain doll, while I was tucked away like a chipped, unwanted piece of crockery. "She was my husband's first wife," Seraphina said, a sharp, dismissive edge creeping into her tone. "She passed many years ago. It is a sad memory, you understand. We prefer not to dwell." "I see," the Duke said, though his tone suggested he saw a great deal more than she intended. He finally turned, and his gaze swept the room. It was a practiced, assessing glance that missed nothing. It passed over the worn brocade of the settee, over Lyra's perfectly arranged curls, over my father's nervous, twitching hands. And then his eyes found the screen. For a heart-stopping second, I was certain he could see me. It was a foolish thought, of course, but his focus was so intense, so unnervingly direct, that I felt pinned, exposed. I shrank back, my heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The moment was broken by my father, Lord Harrington, clearing his throat. "More tea, Your Grace?" he offered, his voice thin and reedy. He was a man who had long ago abdicated his authority in this house for the sake of a quiet life, a life Seraphina orchestrated with ruthless efficiency. He rarely looked at the portrait of his first wife, and he looked at me even less. "No, thank you, my lord," the Duke replied, his attention still lingering on my hiding place. "I believe I have taken enough of your time." He gave a stiff, formal bow to Seraphina and Lyra, his face an unreadable mask. "A pleasure." As he was shown out, the air in the room began to circulate again, but it was charged with a new and unfamiliar energy. The moment the front door clicked shut, Seraphina's sugary facade dissolved. "What was that about?" she hissed, her eyes flashing towards the portrait. Of all the things for him to notice, that dreary, judgmental face. She turned her venomous gaze towards the screen. "Alara, come out from there this instant. You lurk like a spider." I emerged, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, my eyes fixed on the floor. The color of invisibility was a pale, washed-out gray, the color of the dress I wore, the color of my existence. "Did you hear him?" Lyra asked, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She was not deliberately cruel like her mother. She was simply oblivious, wrapped in the warm cocoon of her own beauty and importance. "He seemed so interested in the painting." "He was making conversation, you fool," Serafina snapped. "Men of his station are taught to be observant." It meant nothing. What could he possibly see of interest in that? Her gesture encompassed not just the portrait, but me as well, lumping my mother and me together as one worthless entity. That night I lay awake, the Duke's words echoing in the darkness. A thinking face. It is a rarity. No one had ever described my mother that way. They spoke of her quietness, her fragility. But he had seen the intelligence, the soul behind the eyes. In seeing her, it felt, for a fleeting, impossible moment, as if he had seen me. It was a dangerous thought, a flicker of warmth in the frozen landscape of my life. Hope was a cruel poison, and I had learned long ago not to indulge in it. I told myself it was nothing, a passing comment from a powerful man. He would forget the painting. He would forget he had even been here. I would go back to being a ghost, and the world would continue to turn as it always had. I was wrong. A week later, an invitation arrived. It was delivered by a footman in the Vance livery, a crisp, elegant cream envelope sealed with a severe black wax crest. My hands trembled as I took it from the salver. Serafina snatched it from me, her sharp nails digging slightly into my wrist. She broke the seal with a flick of her thumb, her eyes scanning the heavy parchment. Her expression was a storm of conflicting emotions: triumph, confusion, and a deep, simmering fury. "It is an invitation," she announced, her voice tight. "From the Duke. He requests the pleasure of our company for luncheon at Vancewood." Lyra clapped her hands, her face lighting up. "Oh, Mother, it is for me." He was intrigued after all. I knew it. "Of course it is for you, dearest," Serafina said, but her eyes were still fixed on the page, a deep crease between her brows. "But this is odd," she read aloud, her voice dripping with disbelief. "His Grace, Duke Vance, requests the pleasure of the company of Lord Harrington, Lady Serafina, Miss Lyra Harrington, and Miss Ilara Harrington." My name, spoken aloud in that context, sounded alien. An error, a misprint. I was never included in such invitations. I was the creature of the library and the shadowed hallways, the quiet girl who was always conveniently suffering from a headache or indisposed with a needlework project whenever important company called. "He has included Ilara?" Lyra's delight faltered. "Why would he do that?" "It is a simple courtesy," Serafina said, her voice like the crack of a whip. "A formality. He is aware there are 2 daughters in the house, and his secretary has included both names out of propriety. Nothing more." But her eyes, when they met mine, held a look of pure venom. She saw me not as a person, but as a complication, a weed in the perfect garden she was trying to cultivate for Lyra. "You will, of course, make yourself as unobtrusive as possible," she commanded me. "Wear your gray silk. Say nothing unless you are directly addressed. And for heaven's sake, do not stare." The carriage ride to Vancewood was excruciating. I felt like an imposter, a crow dressed in borrowed feathers, perched beside 2 birds of paradise. Lyra chattered nervously about what she would say, how she would act. Serafina issued a running stream of instructions and corrections. I sat in silence, watching the rolling hills give way to the dense ancient woods that surrounded the Duke's estate. The prison of my own making had suddenly, terrifyingly, expanded its walls. Vancewood was not a palace, it was a fortress. It rose from the earth, a formidable structure of gray stone, its lines clean and severe. Yet, it was not without a kind of stark beauty. As we drew closer, I could see the source of a rumor I had heard whispered in the village. The entire west wing was a ruin. The stone was blackened with soot, the windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the roof was gone, open to the sky. It was a deep, visible wound on an otherwise imposing facade. The Duke received us in a vast hall, where the sound of our footsteps echoed against the marble floor. He was even more intimidating on his own territory. Dressed in simple, dark colors, he seemed to absorb the light, a point of stillness in the cavernous space. He greeted Serafina and Lyra with flawless, icy courtesy. Then he turned to me. "Miss Ilara," he said. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, met mine directly. There was no pity in them, no condescension. There was only a quiet, unnerving intensity. "I am glad you were able to come." I managed a small curtsy, my throat too tight to form words. The directness of his address, the simple fact of it, sent a shockwave through me. Serafina shot me a warning glance, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Luncheon was a stiff, formal affair. The dining room was paneled in dark wood, and the silver was so brightly polished it seemed to hurt the eyes. The Duke was a reserved host, speaking in clipped, precise sentences. He directed most of his conversation towards my father, discussing estate management and politics with an expertise that left Lord Harrington floundering. He was polite to Lyra, but his questions to her about fashion and society gatherings seemed perfunctory, as if he were ticking boxes on a list of required social niceties. He did not speak to me at all. I began to relax, to retreat back into my comfortable invisibility. Serafina was right. It had been a mere formality. I was here as a piece of set dressing, and soon this ordeal would be over. After the meal, the Duke stood. "My lord, perhaps you and the ladies would care to see the gardens," he offered. Then he added, as if it were an afterthought, "My library, however, is in some disarray. I am in the process of reorganizing it. Miss Ilara, I recall hearing you have an interest in historical architecture. Perhaps you would not be bored by a brief look at some of my older folios." The silence was deafening. Serafina's face was a mask of polite fury. Lyra looked utterly bewildered. My father simply looked terrified. To be singled out, to be separated from the group, it was a breach of all protocol. "Your Grace, I would not wish to impose," I stammered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "It is no imposition," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If you will excuse us," he led me away, down a long corridor lined with portraits of his ancestors, their severe faces following me from their gilt frames. I felt Serafina's glare like a physical burn on my back. The library was the most magnificent room I had ever seen. It was 2 stories high, with shelves stretching up into the shadows, accessible by a rolling ladder. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. And just as he had said, it was in a state of controlled chaos. Books were stacked on every available surface, and massive architectural drawings were unrolled on a great central table. "My apologies for the mess," he said, gesturing to the table. "I am planning the reconstruction of the West Wing." I was drawn to the table as if by a magnetic force. The drawings were exquisitely detailed, a blend of historical accuracy and modern innovation. "These are remarkable," I breathed, forgetting my fear in a rush of genuine fascination. "You are honoring the original footprint, but you are not merely replicating it. You are improving the structural integrity with these cross braces." I trailed off, horrified by my own boldness. I had spoken out of turn, offered an unasked-for opinion. He did not seem offended. Instead, a flicker of something, interest, approval, crossed his features. "You have a good eye," he said simply. He pointed to a detail on the plans. The original wing had a fatal flaw in its design, a lack of fire breaks. It is what allowed the blaze to spread so quickly. "The fire," I said softly. "I had heard." "It happened 10 years ago," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. Yet the very air around him seemed to grow colder. "It took my parents. I was away at university. By the time I returned, there was nothing left but a shell." Here was the source of his severity, the heart of his reclusive nature, a grief so profound it had reshaped him, turning him inward, fortifying his walls. I understood, in that moment, the language of his stone fortress and its broken wing. "I am so very sorry, Your Grace," I said, and the words were not a polite platitude, they were heartfelt. He gave a curt nod, as if to dismiss the sentiment. He did not want pity. He changed the subject. 3 years ago, a visiting lecturer from the university, a Professor Albright, gave a talk at the Lyceum in town on the structural principles of Gothic cathedrals. You were in attendance." I stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. I remembered the lecture vividly. It had been a rare treat, a brief escape I had begged for. I had sat in the very back row, a gray mouse in a sea of faces. "How could you possibly know that?" "I was there as well," he said. At the end, during the questions, a young woman in the back asked about the acoustical engineering of the fan vaulting in King's College Chapel, and how it differed from the more percussive resonance of a barrel-vaulted nave. She was told it was too technical a question for the time allotted. The young woman was you. The memory rushed back. The sting of the professor's public dismissal, the heat in my cheeks, the feeling of being foolishly ambitious for daring to ask such a thing. I had shrunk back into my seat, utterly mortified. You remembered that?" I whispered. "It was the most intelligent question asked all evening," he said, his gaze steady and direct. "It was the question of someone who does not merely look, but sees. When I saw the portrait in your home, I recognized the face, not the features, perhaps, but the expression, the intelligence. I wondered if the daughter might possess the same quality as the mother. My carefully constructed world, the one where I was plain and dull and worthless, tilted on its axis. He had not seen a pretty face in a painting. He had not been making polite conversation. He had seen a mind. He had seen my mind, and he had remembered it for 3 years. The hope I had tried so desperately to suppress unfurled within me, a terrifying, beautiful, and fragile green shoot pushing its way through frozen earth. I stood there, in the heart of his fortress, speechless, and for the first time in my life, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being truly, completely seen. In the weeks that followed, my life was irrevocably altered. A quiet pattern emerged, one that left Serafina seething in a state of barely controlled hysteria. Twice a week, a carriage from Vancewood would arrive, not with an invitation, but with a request. The Duke required assistance in cataloging a new acquisition of architectural texts. The Duke sought an opinion on the selection of stone from the local quarry. The requests were always framed with impeccable propriety, addressed to my father, but they were always for me. Each visit to Vancewood felt like stepping from a monochrome world into one of rich, vibrant color. The Duke, Alistair, as he insisted I call him in the privacy of his library, was a different man when we were alone, surrounded by his books and plans. The severe, cold mask he wore for the world would slip, revealing a man of intense passion and a surprisingly gentle nature. Our conversations were the center of this new world. We spoke of everything and nothing. We debated the merits of Palladian symmetry versus the organic chaos of Gothic design. We argued over the nuances of a line in a forgotten poet's work. We traced the histories of families and nations through the lines of their buildings, seeing in a flying buttress or a Doric column the aspirations and fears of an entire culture. In all my life, no one had ever asked for my opinion, let alone listened to it with such focused intensity. He would lean forward, his chin resting on his hand, and his gray eyes would watch me as I spoke, making me feel as though my words had weight and value. "You see the world in terms of structure, Elara," he said one afternoon, as we pored over the blueprints for the new West Wing gallery. "You see the bones beneath the skin." "And you," I replied, my voice gaining a confidence I had never known, "see the soul within the stone." It was in those moments that the connection between us deepened, solidifying from a shared intellectual interest into something far more profound. It was a meeting of minds, a recognition of a similar solitude in each other. He spoke more of the fire, not of the event itself, but of the aftermath. Of the crushing weight of duty, the loneliness of his title, the feeling of being a caretaker to a legacy of ghosts. "This house felt like a tomb when I first inherited it," he confided, his voice low as he stared out the library window at the ruined wing. "Rebuilding it. It is the first thing that has felt like living. Like creating something instead of just preserving what is left." I understood. My life had been one of preservation as well, preserving the peace, preserving my own small quiet space, preserving the memory of my mother. The idea of creating something new, of building a future, was a concept so foreign it felt like a dream. He began to extend small, practical kindnesses that were more intimate than any flowery compliment. He noticed I squinted in the low light and had a pair of elegant reading spectacles delivered to our house. He learned of my love for a particular type of wild strawberry that grew only on the north side of his estate and had a basket of them sent over. When a cold snap hit and I arrived at Vancewood shivering in my thin cloak, I found a heavy cashmere shawl, the color of a stormy sea, draped over the chair he always set out for me. Each gesture was a quiet message. I see you. I notice you. You matter. The terror of hoping was a constant companion. Every night, I would return to the suffocating atmosphere of my home and Serafina's icy glares, and I would tell myself it was all an illusion. I was a plain, quiet girl. He was a duke. This strange, beautiful friendship was a fleeting whim on his part, a curiosity that would soon be satisfied. To believe in anything more was to court heartbreak. But then, one day, the illusion became undeniably real. We were standing over the plans for the new grand staircase. Alistair was explaining his vision for a cantilevered design, a feat of engineering that would make the stone steps appear to float. His passion for the project was palpable. He was tracing the line of the balustrade with his finger, and I reached out, instinctively, to point to a supporting arch he had drawn. Our hands brushed. It was nothing. A fleeting, accidental contact. But he did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand and gently, deliberately, his fingers closed around mine. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up my arm. His skin was warm, his grip firm, yet gentle. The world seemed to slow, the silence in the vast library broken only by the frantic drumming of my own heart. I lifted my gaze from our joined hands to his face. The severity was gone. His expression was one of intense vulnerability, his gray eyes searching mine. A hint of a smile, a true, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, touched his lips. It was a smile of such profound tenderness that it stole the breath from my lungs. He held my hand for a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement passing between us that was more powerful than any declaration. In that touch, I knew. This was not a whim. This was not pity. This was real. And the hope that I had fought so hard against bloomed, brilliant and unstoppable, filling every corner of my being. My newfound happiness was a fragile, sunlit bubble in the oppressive atmosphere of my home. Serafina watched my comings and goings with the predatory stillness of a hawk. My regular visits to Vancewood, the thoughtful gifts that arrived for me, the subtle but undeniable change in my own demeanor, it was all an intolerable affront to her carefully laid plans. Lyra was meant to be the prize, the one to capture a title. My quiet blossoming was a disruption to the natural order of her world. "The Duke is toying with you, you know," she said to me one evening, her voice a sliver of ice. We were in the parlor, and I was reading a book Alistair had sent me. Men of his class are often amused by oddities, a talking dog, a scholarly little mouse. Once the novelty wears off, he will discard you. The words were meant to wound, to plant seeds of doubt, but they no longer had the same power over me. The quiet certainty of Alistair's regard was an armor she could not pierce. I simply looked at her, my expression calm, and said, "I do not believe that is the case," before returning to my book. My refusal to be cowed, my quiet defiance, enraged her more than any tearful outburst could have. I could feel her hatred as a palpable force in the room. Lyra, for her part, was mostly confused. She had been raised to believe that value was measured in beauty, charm, and social grace, currencies I did not possess. "I do not understand it," she confided in me once, a rare moment of sibling intimacy. "He barely looks at me, but when you speak, he listens as if you are uttering prophecies. What do you talk about?" "Buttresses," I said with a small smile, "and books, and the proper mortar mix for restoring 17th century stonework." She simply shook her head, baffled. The idea of a man being captivated by a woman's mind was a concept as foreign to her as the dark side of the moon. The breaking point came a month later. I was returning from Vancewood, my heart light. Alastair had shown me the first stones being laid for the new foundation of the West Wing. He had placed my hand on the cool, rough-hewn granite and said, "This will stand for centuries because of you, Alara. Your insights have made it stronger." The weight of his words, the shared sense of creation, felt more real than anything in my life. As I entered the house, I overheard Serafina's voice coming from my father's study, sharp and urgent. "You must put a stop to it, Richard. The entire county is talking. They are laughing at us, laughing at Lyra. He is making a spectacle of the family by parading your plain, bookish daughter about as some sort of pet project." My father's reply was a weak murmur I could not distinguish. "An arranged marriage," Serafina's voice cut through the air, sharp as shattered glass. "That is the only solution. Sir Reginald Croft has made inquiries. He is old, true, and has a face like a toad, but he has a respectable title and is looking for a quiet, biddable wife to manage his household. Alara will do perfectly. It will put an end to this foolishness with the Duke at once." A cold dread washed over me, so intense it made me feel faint. Sir Reginald Croft was a lecherous old man who looked at me with greasy appraisal whenever we met in town. The thought of being bound to him was a fate worse than death. It was the extinguishing of the small, precious flame of life Alastair had kindled within me. I fled to my room, my mind racing. Serafina would not be content to merely suggest it. She would act. She would maneuver and manipulate until my father, in his desire for peace, acquiesced. She saw the growing connection between me and the Duke not just as a social inconvenience, but as a direct threat to her absolute control over the family and its assets. The next day, my fears were confirmed. I saw her at her writing desk in the morning room, a place she rarely used. She was writing with a fierce, hurried energy. Later, I passed the hall table and saw the letter, waiting for the footman to take to the post. It was addressed in her elegant, spidery hand to His Grace, Duke Vance, Vancewood. I knew with a sickening certainty what it contained. It was not a social note, it was a weapon. A poisoned dart aimed directly at the heart of the fragile, beautiful world Alastair and I were building. I could almost hear the words she would have written, lies cloaked in concern, accusations dressed as pity. She would paint me as a delusional, obsessive creature, a mentally unstable girl who had misinterpreted a powerful man's kindness. She would be trying to sever the connection, to make him recoil in distaste and embarrassment, clearing the path for her to push me into a disastrous marriage and refocus the Duke's attention, she hoped, on Lyra. The gut punch of her betrayal was absolute. For years she had made me feel worthless and invisible. Now that someone finally saw me, she was trying to blind him, to erase me all over again, this time for good. I stood there, staring at the innocent-looking cream envelope, and felt the foundations of my newfound hope begin to crumble into dust. The summons came 2 days later. It was not a gentle request, but a formal, almost cold note requesting the presence of my father, my stepmother, Lyra, and myself at Vancewood that afternoon. A matter of some urgency was to be discussed. Serafina was radiant with triumph. She wore her finest afternoon dress and a small, viciously satisfied smile. "You see," she whispered to me as we prepared to leave, "the Duke has come to his senses. He is likely calling this meeting to politely disentangle himself. Try not to make a scene, Alara. It would be dreadfully common." I was numb. A hollow ache had settled in my chest, a familiar grief for a happiness I had only just begun to believe was possible. Serafina's letter would have been a masterpiece of manipulation. Against her word, the word of a titled lady, what chance did I have? Alastair was a man of logic and reason. He would see the potential for scandal, the inconvenience of a situation spun to look like a young woman's pathetic obsession. He would retreat behind the high walls of his fortress, and I would be left outside, in the cold. The journey to Vancewood was a funeral procession. Serafina's mood was buoyant, Lyra's was anxious, and my father's was, as always, nervously compliant. I felt nothing but a profound, weary resignation. I had been a fool to hope. The world was as it had always been. We were not shown into one of the grand reception rooms. We were led directly to the library. Alistair was standing by the great fireplace, his back to us, staring into the flames. The room felt different today. The air was not filled with the comfortable energy of shared discovery, but with a taut, formal tension. His housekeeper, a stern but kind-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, showed us in and then positioned herself discreetly near the door, her hands folded. It was highly unusual. She was not a servant, she was a witness. Alistair turned. His face was carved from ice. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a chilling, formidable calm. He looked at Seraphina, his gaze so penetrating that her triumphant smile faltered. "Lady Seraphina," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "Thank you for coming, and thank you for your recent letter. I found it illuminating." He held up her letter, pinched between two fingers as if it were something distasteful. Seraphina paled slightly but recovered quickly. "Your Grace, I wrote only out of the deepest concern for all parties. I could not stand by and watch a delicate situation escalate." "Ah, yes, the delicate situation," Alistair said, his eyes never leaving her face. "You wrote, and I quote, 'I fear my stepdaughter, in her naivety, has developed an unfortunate and intense fixation. Her mind is fanciful, and she is prone to building castles in the air. I worry for her stability.'" He let the words hang in the silent room. I felt a flush of profound shame creep up my neck. To hear her cruel lies spoken aloud in his voice was a unique form of torture. "A mother's worry, Your Grace," Seraphina murmured, placing a hand on her heart. "Indeed," Alistair said, his voice dropping even lower. "It is a powerful thing, as is a daughter's inheritance." He moved to the great table. Upon it was not her letter, but a different set of documents. Thick, legal-looking ledgers bound in leather. My father shifted, looking confused. "Your concern for Alara's well-being is so profound," Alistair continued, his calm delivery more terrifying than any shout, "that I was moved to look into her affairs myself. I was curious about the estate left to her by her mother, the late Lady Harrington, an estate of which you, Lady Seraphina, became the sole trustee upon your marriage to her father." Seraphina's face had gone from pale to ashen. I do not see what that has to do with anything." "Don't you?" Alistair tapped one of the ledgers. "These are the account books. And these," he gestured to a second stack of papers, "are the reports from my own man of business, who has spent the last 48 hours conducting a thorough audit. He is a remarkably efficient man. He discovered a pattern of discrepancies. Investments made with Alara's capital that yielded returns paid directly into your own accounts. Property sold, with the profits vanishing. A systematic and deliberate embezzlement of your stepdaughter's inheritance spanning almost a decade." A choked gasp escaped my father's lips. Lyra stared at her mother, her blue eyes wide with horror. Seraphina looked trapped, her mask of gentility shattering to reveal the raw, desperate greed beneath. "Lies!" she spat, her voice no longer honeyed, but a venomous hiss. "This is a trick. She has poisoned you against me with her pathetic stories." "Alara has told me nothing," Alistair said, his voice cutting through her tirade like a blade through silk. "She has spoken to me of architecture, of history, of poetry. She has never uttered a single word against you. Your letter, however, spoke volumes about your character. It was the desperate act of a woman who saw her source of income about to gain a powerful ally. You were not trying to protect her, you were trying to cage her." He had not believed her. For one single heart-stopping moment, he had not doubted me. He had seen her letter for the poison it was, and had used his power not to push me away, but to protect me, to unearth the truth. Empowered by his unshakable faith, a strength I never knew I possessed rose up in me. I took a step forward, and all eyes turned to me. I looked directly at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to crush my spirit. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it filled the silent room. "For 18 years," I began, "you have told me in 1,000 different ways that I was worthless. I was too plain, too quiet, too serious. I was a disappointment. I was a burden. You taught me to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to apologize for my own existence. You stole my mother's money, but that is nothing compared to what you tried to steal. You tried to steal my belief in my own worth. I turned my gaze to my father, who flinched. And you let her. For the sake of a quiet house, you stood by and watched me fade away. I looked at Lyra, who had tears streaming down her face. You never saw me at all. Finally, I looked back at Serafina, whose face was contorted with pure hatred. But you failed, I said, my voice ringing with a final cathartic clarity. You did not break me. You only hid me, and he found me. The silence that followed was absolute. My father sank into a chair, his face in his hands, weeping. Lyra took a hesitant step away from her mother, a small but definitive movement towards me. Serafina stood alone, exposed and utterly defeated. Her reign of quiet tyranny was over. In the heart of the Duke's library, surrounded by the evidence of her crimes and the wreckage of her lies, I was finally, completely free. Serafina was escorted from the room by two grim-faced footmen Alistair had summoned with a quiet pull of a bell rope. She did not go quietly, her final, desperate hisses of protest echoing down the hall before being cut off by the heavy closing of a door. My father, a broken man, followed soon after, mumbling apologies I could not bring myself to hear. Lyra lingered for a moment. She came to me, her beautiful face streaked with tears, and took my hand. I am so sorry, Alara, she whispered. I was blind. I am so sorry. I squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of a sisterhood that might, one day, be rebuilt from the ruins. Then she, too, was gone. And I was alone with him. The silence in the library was no longer tense, but profound. It was the quiet after a storm, clean and resonant. Alistair had not moved. He stood by the table, watching me, his gray eyes holding an emotion I could not quite decipher. It was not pity, it was something deeper, something akin to awe. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. I nodded, though my legs felt unsteady. "I think so," I said, my own voice a near whisper. I have never spoken like that in my life." "It was magnificent," he said simply. He crossed the room and gently took my arm. "Come," he said, "you need some air." He led me not back to the formal rooms, but through a side door that opened onto a stone balcony. The cool evening air was a balm on my heated skin. The balcony overlooked the vast, manicured gardens, their perfect geometric patterns softened by the twilight. In the distance, the skeletal remains of the West Wing stood stark against the darkening sky. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the first stars begin to prick the velvet canopy above. The emotional tumult inside me began to settle, replaced by a deep, quiet sense of peace. I was no longer a ghost. I was a person who had spoken her truth and had been heard. "Her greatest mistake," Alistair said, his voice a low murmur beside me, "was in believing your worth was something she could conceal. It is not an adornment, Alara. It is the very structure of you. It is bedrock." I turned to look at him. In the dim light, his severe features were softened. The formidable Duke was gone, and in his place was just Alistair, the man who saw the bones beneath the skin, the soul within the stone. "Why?" I asked, the question I had been too afraid to voice for weeks. "Why me?" He turned to face me fully, taking both of my hands in his. His grip was warm and steady, an anchor in the shifting world. "Because from the first moment I heard you speak, in the back of that dusty lecture hall, I recognized a mind that was not content with surfaces. Because when I look at you, I do not see a plain or quiet woman. I see a mind that burns like a star. I see a strength you didn't even know you possessed. I see the woman who is helping me build my home and my life back from the ashes." He lifted one of my hands and brushed his lips against my knuckles, a gesture of such reverence it made my heart ache. "I am not a man for poetic speeches, Alara. I deal in facts, in structures, in foundations. And the simple fact is, my life was a ruin before you walked into it. You have brought light and reason and a hope I thought was lost forever. I do not want to rescue you. I want to stand beside you. I want to build with you." He paused, his gaze searching mine, his own vulnerability laid bare. "I see you, Alara Harrington. In all the world, I see you. Will you let me see you for the rest of my life? Will you be my wife? Will you be my duchess?" Tears I had not shed in the face of my stepmother's cruelty now welled in my eyes and traced paths down my cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. This was not a fairy tale ending where a prince saves a damsel. This was a proposal of partnership, of respect, of two solitary souls finding their counterpart. "Yes," I breathed, the word a release, a promise, a beginning. "Yes, Alistair, I will." He smiled then, that slow, rare smile that transformed his face, and it was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. He lowered his head, and his lips met mine. The kiss was not a fiery explosion, but a deep, quiet homecoming. It was the end of a very long winter, the gentle warmth of the first spring sun on frozen ground. It was the feeling of a keystone sliding perfectly into place, making the entire structure sound and whole. It was certainty. It was peace. 1 year later. The West Wing was complete. Sunlight, brilliant and clear, streamed through the soaring windows of the new gallery, illuminating the polished oak floors and the warm, honey-colored stone of the walls. It was no longer a place of ghosts and ashes, but a space filled with light, air, and life. Our life. I stood at the center of the room, my hand resting on Alistair's arm, his presence a constant, reassuring warmth beside me. We were looking at a new portrait that had been hung just that morning over the grand fireplace. It was not of a solitary woman with a thinking face, though my mother's portrait now held the place of honor in our library. This new painting was of the two of us. Alistair was seated in a large armchair, a book open on his lap, and I was perched on the arm of the chair, leaning slightly against him, my hand resting on his shoulder. We were not looking at the artist. We were looking at each other, and the painter had perfectly captured the quiet, contented understanding in our expressions. "He has your eyes just right," Alistair murmured, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "He has caught the way they see things." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "And he has caught your smile, the real one." A year had passed since that terrible, wonderful day in the library. Serafina, disgraced and facing legal ruin, had accepted a meager settlement and exiled herself to the continent. My father and Lyra, humbled and contrite, were slowly rebuilding their lives, and Lyra and I were carefully, tentatively, rebuilding our sisterhood. She had found a suitor of her own, a kind country gentleman who loved her for her sweetness, not her potential as a social asset. But all of that felt very far away. My world was here, within these walls we had rebuilt together, with the man who had looked into the shadows and seen not a ghost, but a person. I was the Duchess of Vance, a title that still felt strange on my tongue, but I was also, more importantly, Alara. I was an architect, a partner, a wife. I was a woman who was no longer afraid of taking up space, whose opinions were sought, whose mind was valued, whose heart was cherished. Alistair turned me to face him, his hands cupping my face gently. "Happy, my love?" he asked, his gray eyes soft. "Completely," I replied, and it was the simplest, truest thing I had ever said. I was no longer the girl behind the screen. I was the woman in the portrait. A portrait of a life built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared passions, and the profound, life-altering miracle of being truly and completely seen.